You are now watching Zach Lesage PTCG. Let's get it! Yo, what's poppin' YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Zach Lesage. Word up! Today we are going to be covering over the top 10 decks as I attempt to break down the metagame in this week's power rankings. So I mean, that's a whole bunch of words, but at the end of the day, I'm going to showcase my personal top 10 decks, or the top 10 decks, their combination of just like top performing lists and stuff like that, and explain exactly where we are in the metagame at any particular time. So I do cover this every Monday, so stay tuned for my channel for that. If you haven't already subscribed, hit that subscribe button. The lists are in the pinned comment below, and I mean, there's just a bunch of good stuff going on. That being said, I don't want to take up too much time, but we are going to be covering over the top 10 decks, explaining exactly why they're placed within the top 10, where I think they're going, where I think they're heading, and any potential tech cards, etc, etc. So let's jump into our number 10 spot and see exactly what's going on there. Kicking off our number 10 spot this week, we have Green's Reshiram and Charizard GX. So this is a new entry to our list for our top 10 meta breakdown. And why did it make the list? Well, it's because it's pretty good against decks that are weak to fire. And as much as that sounds really basic, Luke Metal's been crushing it at the top. This deck has a decent bit of matchups throughout the top 10, and that's how it's able to creep in. If anyone's wondering, it did force out the Mewtwo Victini deck from last week, but I think it's one of those things where this is one of those decks where it's okay because they're both fire type decks. So in general, don't necessarily look at it as the number 10 spot is gone. We basically have the same amount of decks or similar decks within the top 10. So this is the only new entry that we have into this week, but the rest of the things shake up the list. So where exactly does this deck kind of gain its strength? You can use Volcanian's Flare Starter going second to rip 3 energies out of your deck and attach them to your Pokemon in any way you like. And I mean, considering there's only 2 Pokemon, you're basically going to be powering up a Reshiram and Charizard GX. That's so you could use Flare Strike, Double Blaze GX, etc, etc, giving you options to attack through your opponent's Pokemon. With tech cards such as Fan of Waves, Lily's Pokédoll, Great Potion, Great Catcher, Tool Scrapper, this deck can kind of cherry pick whatever it wants through Green's Exploration to use at any given time. Why does Green's Exploration work in this deck and not other decks? Well, you can use this card only if you have no Pokemon with abilities in play. Both Volcanion and Reshizard don't have any abilities, so you could just always search for 2 trainers, and if you're not playing a Welder, you're playing a Green's Exploration, and if you're not playing a Green's Exploration, then you're playing a boss. The deck kind of has some set rules, and it's fairly easy to play if you understand what you're doing. It's the biggest issue it's going to come from making sure you understand your early actions with Green's Exploration, how those can affect the entire game. But overall, this deck seems to be effective. It was very close to making the top 10 list last week, but it did make it this week, so we'll see if it can continue on. I'd say that this deck is probably going to hover on and off the list, depending on how the metagame shapes up. But if it gets a huge breakout performance, of course it will find its way back in. Let's jump into our number 9 spot. Hopping into our number 9 spot, we got Mad Party. Now, Mad Party placed 9th place last week, 9th place this week. So one might say that the deck's pretty stable. I'd say that Rapid Strike Urshifu is not necessarily making too many moves, so this deck is likely going to be tied to the success of Rapid Strike Urshifu. Considering Rapid Strike Urshifu had a very similar week that it did the week before, I think that Mad Party again is just going to anchor itself a couple spots lower than Rapid Strike, unless of course there's a lot of Psychic decks that pop up, such as other Mewtwo variants or other decks that Mad Party might necessarily have a good matchup against, and that's really where Mad Party is going to be. It's either going to be the metagame is very good for Mad Party because the metagame is very bad for Rapid Strike Urshifu, and that's when this deck's going to overperform and get one of those top 5 placements, or it's going to just be appropriately placed within the lower half of the top 10 because Rapid Strike Urshifu is not necessarily moving, which the case is the latter. This deck basically works by discarding Mad Party Pokemon to attack with Bunnelby or Poltegeist. Both of those Pokemon can do a lot of damage for either a Twin Energy or a Triple Acceleration Energy depending on the Pokemon, and you try to find ways to discard cards throughout your deck with Quick Ball or Dedenne GX, Professor's Research, T-Break. There's a lot of options to get Pokemon in your discard pile. This deck's biggest issue is probably its inconsistency factor because it's only running off of 7 energies. I've seen some lists that play 8. going into 4 twin, 4 triple acceleration energy, but I think this deck's pretty cool. One thing to note, as some decks are experimenting with Wondrous Labyrinth in the deck, you might want to add a Chaotic Swell. I think the Chaotic Swell spot would come at the cost of the Escape Rope, so if you do notice a trend upward in the Wondrous Lab seeing played, I do think that you should play a Chaotic Swell instead of the Escape Rope, just to give yourself that little bit of an out. Otherwise, this list is going to remain virtually untouched from last week, so we'll see how it continues on to the next week. I think it's probably going to stay fairly similar for the next few upcoming weeks. But what's in our number 8 spot, we'll find out right now. Jumping into our number 8 spot, we see Pikachu and PikaRom GX, and I mean, this is a deck that unfortunately has fallen quite down 4 spots to be exact, because it was previously number 4 on this list beforehand. What happened to this deck? Well, through ADPzation is not necessarily the greatest matchup this deck can face. Luke Metal is not necessarily the greatest matchup that this deck can face. TempoZard is one of those things where it can win, it can't win. Like, it's one of those things where maybe Pikachu and PikaRom GX against a lot of the kind of top decks right now struggles. And I'd say it doesn't necessarily have matchups where you're instantly winning those games. A lot of decks play Crushing Hammer. A lot of decks, you play Crushing Hammer. Like, there's a lot of factors that are reliant not on your skill in a game. Sure, Pikachu and PikaRom GX gives you the ability to feel like you're playing out a game, but a lot of the times I don't necessarily feel like you're in full control as you once were, and I think it's just due to increased competition. So I'd say this deck is probably going to slip a little bit out of the top 5, and then it's probably placed a little bit too low at 8, but I could see this deck being a number 6, number 7 kind of deck. 8, 9, 10 is probably a little too low for PikaRom, but as this deck sees less and less success, it's not that hard to slip out of the top 10, as we've seen with other decks. How does this deck work? Use Bolton V to electrify, power up some lightning energies onto your Pokemon, such as Pikachu, PikaRom GX, Mewtwo and Mew-GX, Reshiram and Charizard, Raichu and Alolan Raichu. You can tell it's a Monday because I'm not even pronouncing the Pokemon correctly. On top of having a bunch of different attacks, so whether you want to attack with Full Blitz to accelerate energies or Tandem Shock to paralyze your opponent's Pokemon, this deck has other ways to accelerate energies such as Tapu Koko Prism Star, drawing cards with Speed Lightning Energy, or disrupting your opponent with Marnian Reset Stamp. This deck has a lot of cool things that it could do in the format. Unfortunately, it's probably too low HP comparatively to other tag teams that are being quite successful at the time. So this deck came out the first tag team set team up all the way back in 2019. Doesn't sound that long ago, but we're in 2021, and when Pokemon have 340 HP, 240 is not necessarily the most HP that we have for a 3 prize card Pokemon. Now, Big Charm can only do so much, and Crushing Hammer can only hide that HP factor. But it is one of those things where this deck has been keeping up with the format. This deck is always a solid choice. It might just not be the best choice forever. So keep that in mind if you are a PikaRom fan. This is the deck that I brought to the Players' Cup 2. I've put this deck away for the meantime. I just don't necessarily think it's super well positioned right now. With that being said, we'll see if our number 7 spot where that deck is at right now. Jumping into our number 7 spot, we have Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX. Now, this deck also was previously number 7 last week, and similar to Mad Party, I think the metagame is kind of volatile for this deck. It's not necessarily going to be moving up too much or down too much. I think it's probably appropriately placed the way that the metagame is turning out. And that's due to increased competition from Psychic decks. We see that Grass Mewtwo and Galaxy Mewtwo are definitely gunning up there. We know that TempoZard and ADP can give this deck a run for its money. Mad Party, even below this deck, can give this deck a run for its money. So it's very similar to Pikachu and PikaRom GX. There's not a lot of great matchups out there, and as other decks have kind of figured out to deal with this deck, it's one of those things where it could just kind of, it stays where it stays. It's not the number 1 deck anymore because enough decks have kind of been in there. If you run into a Luke Metal deck, they're just going to put out a Zamazenta and then you don't have an answer. This deck, personally, my list doesn't have an answer for Phoebe. I don't have a Phoebe in there to try to beat Luke Metal, but even Phoebe with Mewtwo lists have been struggling against Zamazenta, so it's one of those things where you got to cut your losses somewhere. How does this deck work? Well, this deck uses Gale Thrust. So if you evolve into a Urshifu VMAX and then bring it up to the active, you can swing for 150. Very efficient attack to do 150 damage. Then you can slap on a Rapid Strike energy, putting another couple energies on there, so you can use Gmax Rapid Flow. You could snipe a couple Pokemon. Now, in the event where your opponent does not have Mew in play, you can kind of set up a bunch of multi-prize card knockouts, where you could draw a bunch of prize cards all in one turn. Very similar strategy to what we've seen with like Dragapults in the past. Similar things such as that. Nowadays, it's one of those things where there is Mew that does block things. There are Psychic decks that are holding this deck back. So this deck's probably the case where it's appropriately powered up for the metagame. It makes sense in this current metagame. It's the surrounding decks that kind of are countering this deck to put it here. So it's not that it's a bad deck by any chance. Same way that Lapras VMAX has been in other formats where Pikachu and PikaRom is the best deck in formats. This deck just loses to a lot of the decks within the top 10, and that's really what's holding it back. So if it sneaks through the cracks, it's probably winning through the tournament. If it's not sneaking through the cracks, it's barely making those top 32s. So we'll have to see if the metagame kind of opens up a little bit more to see if this deck can go up a little bit. It certainly has the potential to, and it has in the past. But as the metagame understands where this deck has been, I think they're going to gatekeep it for the foreseeable future. Let's jump into our number 6 spot. Jumping into our number 6 spot, we got Galaxy Mewtwo, and as other people call it, JIT 2. I do want to give some respect to everyone from the JIT server, JIT meaning younger kid, younger generation, at least in urban slang. They are really the ones who are pushing the result with this deck, so shout out to all of them. Y'all know who you are. That being said, this deck focuses on using a bunch of different Pokemon's attacks by using Mewtwo and Mew GX's Perfection ability to copy either GX Pokemon from in play or from your discard pile. Some Pokemon are only available from your discard pile, like Incineroar GX or Vileplume GX. Other ones can be in play, such as Jirachi GX or Latios GX. You're really going to try to choose the correct attacks at 1 energy, 2 energy, 3 energy plus at the correct time. And that's really where this deck's going to see success. Maybe you need to block your opponent's GX ability. Maybe you need to shuffle their hand away. Maybe there's a bunch of different actions you want. This is the type of deck that's going to reward strong play, foresight in the game, and understanding matchups. In other cases, this deck can also just be inconsistent at times. It's not that it's an inconsistent deck. I've just noticed that, like, with all these different attacking options, sometimes you're not necessarily going to have them. And I mean, 4 copies of Cherish Ball and 4 copies of Quick Ball are both going to allow you to get them out there. I'm just saying sometimes it feels like you just can't get the right attack off. And maybe that's just me and my experience with this deck, but I do really like this deck and I have put a lot of effort into it. So it's one of those things where maybe I'm not the only one. Where is this deck kind of placed in the meta? Well, this deck is probably appropriately placed within the lower half of the top 5, upper half of the top 10. And that's because this deck is going to be, it holds its own. It has some answers against a lot of the top decks. So if you run into certain matchups, you could basically sign those off as almost secured wins. But as the metagame kind of grows, we're getting more and more decks that just challenge this deck. So whereas something like Rapid Strike Urshifu or Pikachu and PikaRom GX have decent matchups across the board, and when I say decent matchups, I mean like they're pretty even, middle of the road matchups. In other cases, this deck has polarizing wins or losses. So if you run against, let's say, I don't even know what you'd run against. Let's say like an ADP, you could shut off their GX attack with Latios, and then just kind of like push them out of the game. That should be strong enough for you to be able to win. In other cases, if you run against an Eternatus with this deck, you're probably just going to get knocked out over and over again, especially as Eternatus decks are playing Tool Jammer to get over Big Charm, which just makes the matchup worse and worse. So as other decks creep into the metagame, this deck's probably appropriately placed. It went down from number 3 last week to number 6 because other players are experimenting with other decks that kind of counter Rapid Strike Urshifu. So Psychic type players are usually going to stay Psychic type players, or at least in this case, Galaxy Mewtwo players can bridge over to Grass Mewtwo because they're both Mewtwo decks, or maybe they're even going to be playing other decks that play Mewtwo like Pikachu and PikaRom GX, whereas they're not necessarily switching over to decks like Luke Metal or TempoZard or anything like that. So I think that this deck's probably going to stay like I said, similarly placed within the metagame, depending on how the metagame changes. If E-Turn continuously goes up, maybe we see Rapid Strike Urshifu go up, and we see this deck go up. Otherwise, we'll have to see exactly what's going on. Let's jump into our number 5 spot at the halfway point. Jumping into our number 5 spot at the halfway mark, we do have Grass Mewtwo. Now, similar to Galaxy Mewtwo, I've seen this deck called Mewtwo Rillaboom, I've seen this deck called Boombox. I'm just gonna go with Grass Mewtwo. I think that probably describes the deck easiest to the masses. Again, I don't want to ruin anyone's day with a personal name or anything like that. I just try to go with the most middle-of-the-road approach and what most people are going to commonly call the deck. This deck focuses on using Rillaboom's Voltage Beat to power up Mewtwo and Mew-GX, similar to Galaxy Mewtwo, where you're using Perfection to copy other Pokemon, whether they're in play or in your discard pile. In this case, you're copying either Rowlet, Alolan Executor, Dragonite, Incineroar. You get the kind of idea. This deck's based off more of a tag call engine, so similar to Luke Metalization with Malolana, Guzma Hala, Cynthia Caitlyn, to kind of pinpoint exactly what you're trying to draw into at any given point. So you're going to be using Super Growth to quickly evolve Grookey into a Thwackey into a Rillaboom, and then you're going to use Rillaboom to power up Mewtwo so you could use a handful of attacks. Why is this deck at number 5? I mean, similar to other Mewtwo decks, I think these decks are going to be more of a middle tier deck, not necessarily going to be those huge decks that have a great matchup. Of course, playing any Mewtwo deck is going to come with some weaknesses. There could be the Mimikyu with Shadow Box, or you might be forced into running a Stealthy Hood. In this case, you have kind of grass type attackers if you run into a Stealthy Hood, but in the case of Galaxy Mewtwo, the deck that we just saw before this, they do play Stealthy Hood to get around that. So Mewtwo's going to have its own counters, power plant of course, but where this deck kind of gains strength is just your like different attacks, and it might be a little bit more efficient to be able to search them out with Rillaboom. So maybe these attacks are better than what a Welder Mewtwo could offer, what a Galaxy Mewtwo could offer. I mean, however you're powering a Mewtwo comes at some kind of cost, so this is going to be more grass based, whereas Galaxy Mewtwo is only going to be 1 energy per turn, but you could use a bunch of different attacks. I think that this deck's just been performing really well. If I could kind of pinpoint anything, Azul played this for a tournament, was going to be playing Galaxy Mewtwo, decided to submitted the wrong deck, went in with Grass Mewtwo, and that's as far as I understand from the story. Did well at that tournament, and a lot of people just saw that and went with the deck's success and kind of just branched off of that. A lot of other top players picked up this deck, such as Stefan Ivanov, Tord Rekliv, and here we are with this deck now. Is it here to stay? I mean, I think it's here to stay within the lower part of the top 5, upper part of the top 10, so anywhere between like a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kind of placement, if I could ever give this anything, but we'll have to see how the metagame continues to progress. Let's jump into our number 4 spot. Jumping into our number 4 spot, we got Eternatus VMAX. Now, this deck was previously number 5 on the list, so moving up number 4 doesn't make too much of a difference. Anything that's like 1 spot is just going to be probably just how the tournament results or how my personal feelings changed on a week-by-week basis. This one's not going to be any different. It's just saw more tournament success, so of course it's going to be at number 4. Now, the thing that's going to be really different here is going to be the list. So normal lists are running 1 Phoebe, 1 Palpad, or 1 Phoebe, 1 Sableye V. I really decided to go with the Tool Jammer effort, and I think I know a lot about this deck. It's one of those decks that I feel very comfortable with changing cards. I know that myself, my testing group, Gabriel Smart, Michelle Babin, my girlfriend, we've all really worked on this deck, and we've seen a lot of success with Eternatus in the past few months. Now, Tool Jammer is gonna stop a lot of things like Big Charm or just things in your opponent's tracks. Now, we have seen this card becoming a little bit more popular, but I don't necessarily know if Crushing Hammers are necessary at this time. If you look at the top decks, ADP, you're gonna win with or without Crushing Hammers. It's only gonna be stopping them or if they get a Crushing Hammer off on you. If you just make your deck more consistent with Energy Spinner, extra Pokemon communication, extra energy, of course your deck's gonna see some setup. Against TempoZard, the Crushing Hammer is not gonna matter. Against Mewtwo's decks, it's not really gonna matter. Against Rapid Strike Urshifu, you already are going to lose. So it's really one of those things where the Crushing Hammers are not really doing anything in this particular metagame. And with Eternatus not being the most popular deck, if you play an Eternatus without Crushing Hammers, you could just take your chances there. So this is really more against the rest of the field. You're going to lose to Rapid Strike Urshifu, you're going to lose to Eternatus, but you're going to have good matchups against everything else. So, going in with the double Phoebe, going in with a lot of things, there's a lot of cool cards that you could just play in this deck. and the way that this deck list looks very clean. So I think it's something worthwhile to try out. I'm probably going to be covering this exact deck on my channel, but the whole thing is you're going to be using the Eternal Zone ability to have a bunch of dark Pokemon in play, use Dread End to do 270 damage to your opponent's Pokemon, and use Tool Jammer to get over things like Big Charm or anything else that's really stopping you or in your way. You could also use Tool Jammer to just like kind of block your opponent's air balloons right in their tracks, forcing them to use extra switch, etc, etc. But I think this version of the deck looks quite good, maybe even cutting up boss orders for a Pal Pad just to secure that Luke Metal matchup. But right now I think this deck looks incredibly good, so we'll see exactly how it goes. Let's jump into our number 3 spot. Jumping into our number 3 spot, we have the deck that Caleb Rogerson used to win the Sunday Open, and that is TempoZard. Now, from what I've read, they believe this is Andrew Hedrick's list, so I do want to give a shout out if that is anything about that, but I do know that both Caleb Rogerson and Andrew Hedrick do work well together on multiple decks, so a lot of it is just, it makes sense that they would come up with a concept such as this. So it takes the regular TempoZard list, basically cuts a Reshiram and a Cramorant for a Marshadow and a Heatran GX. The Marshadow is more to get past Chaotic Swell, which has been seeing a lot of play lately, and the Heatran GX gives you options to attack with another Pokemon. I like the kind of fire toolbox kind of approach to this deck, similar to how I was running Ability, Reshiram, and Charizard GX in the past when we had Victini, Prism, Legal, and there was other Pokemon to attack with. I do like that there's Heatran GX, and I've said a few times in other videos, if you don't have one of these cards like Heatran GX, something would be suitable as something that you could power up. So maybe you have a Stoutland V, or maybe you have a Double V. Those would be other Pokemon that would be powerful enough for a deck like this. This deck works off using Jirachi's Stellar Wish to fish out cards that you need to attack with the Pokemon that you want to attack with. Whether you want to attack with Blacephalon doing Fireball Circus, whether you want to be doing Spit Shot on Cramorant V to snipe your opponent's Dedenite GX, Heatran GX for a bunch of energy in play, or Reshiram and Charizard GX a Double Blaze GX out of nowhere. You have Welders, Fire Crystals, Scoop Up Neds, Giant Hearths, always cards that you're searching for. So this deck is really all about sequencing your cards in the proper order and then determining what's the best way to kind of tackle each matchup. The deck is easy at its core because you're just blindlessly weldering to Pokemon, but as you play this deck more and more, there are a lot of minute decisions that really matter in the end game, and it really shows the difference between who's playing this deck at the best, such as Caleb, or who's just playing this deck as like a kind of a welder toolbox deck. I think that this deck's probably appropriately placed in the metagame within the top 5. Number 3 might be a little bit high, and I think a lot of the success is probably going to wear off in the next like couple days or so. So I think that this deck is like, it's okay, but as more people realize that they just can't play this deck to the fullest like Caleb can or as Andrew can, I think this deck's probably going to trickle between lower top 5, higher top 10. So anywhere between that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kind of spots in the metagame. So we'll have to see exactly how it goes. I think this deck's awesome, and it's much better for 2 out of 3. So if you are playing in the GD Tour tournament this weekend, which is a 2 out of 3 cashed event, this is a very good choice. Although when this deck does well, watch out for Tapu Finis. Let's jump into our number 2 spot. Jumping into our number 2 spot, we got Luke Metalization, and this deck was previously number 1. What happened? Well, it moved 1 spot, so I mean, it could just be minor metagame changes, as we saw TempoZard went from all the way from number 10 to number 3. That might have a thing to do against a deck that is primarily weak to fire type decks. So I'd say that that would be enough to drop it down a spot. Now, this is the deck that I've been playing for the most of my Players Cup keys. I've been seeing a lot of success with it. And I mean, Josh Sutherland kind of birthed this deck to everyone in this current iteration. It's been really like the broken Luke Metal, as this deck has been called. It's just so powerful, giving you lots of options. Whether you're attacking with Zacian V, discarding your opponent's energies, and reducing damage with Luke Metal, or just walling VMAXs with Dauntless Shield, this deck seems to have it all. It uses Tag Call to cherry pick whatever you want of the deck, very similar to the GreenZard deck that we saw at the bottom of the list. This deck can kind of just choose what it's looking for and then kind of deal with it either passively or go after your opponent aggressively. I personally have cut the Chaotic Swell out of this deck for a Wondrous Labyrinth. I'm still testing that, so I haven't necessarily put that list out here right now, but it is one of those things where this deck has seen a lot of success. It does continue to see success, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw this deck go between number 1 or number 3, depending on how other decks are really dealing with the metagame at the current time. I mean, there's not really much to say that hasn't been said already about this deck. You only have 3 attackers, so you got to choose your attacks very carefully. You do have Metal Saucers to power up those Pokemon, but a lot of it is methodically understanding what you're doing in any given matchup, and then really determining your best rate of play or your best kind of game plan. Even starting with the correct Pokemon can really alter how a game goes, so understanding how the metagame is, like, even if you're playing like a Players Cup key, for example, and you have a choice between starting between a Luke Metal or a Zamazenta, a lot of the things that you have to just, like, you need to be like, okay, what's on my opponent's deck box? Does that make any sense at all, depending on which Pokemon I'm going to start with? Is there matchups where I don't need to use Luke Metal? Are there other, like, is there any information? Did they mulligan? Like, these are things that are really going to take you from playing this deck at a basic level to a top tier level. And I mean, I've been in those cases too, where I see my opponent with Eternatus sleeves, and I flip over Zamazenta and they flip over an ADP. It's not always going to work, but you got to use all the information that you have available, if you have any information available. Sometimes you're just going to go with it, but when in doubt, Zacian's usually the best starter in any given case. You're always going to have at least one Zacian every single matchup, and then really determining if you need anything else. So follow this deck along for more success. I do plan on covering this deck a little bit more because I think it's the real deal, like, very good deck, and it's my current favorite deck in format, but we'll have to see exactly how it goes. Let's jump into our number 1 spot and see exactly what's up. Another week goes by and we have made it to our number 1 spot. Our number 1 spot going this week, shout out to ADPZ. Previously number 2, jumping to number 1. So similar, just kind of flip-flopping spots with Luke Metal, and it's probably because this deck can handle fire type matchups a little bit better than Luke Metal can at times. Or it's just because this deck is generally more powerful or has a more broad range matchup approach, whereas Luke Metal is going to lose to some matchups. This deck is usually in the game against most other decks. So this is really the version of the deck that Andrew Hedrick gave us a couple weeks ago. I've seen Caleb Rogerson again had some success cutting an escape rope, adding the 3rd switch, but nothing's really changing from this deck. How does this deck work? Well, you're going to be using Altered Creation GX for a Metal Energy and a Water Energy, flipping that GX counter over, and you're doing plus 30 damage for the rest of the game, and drawing an extra prize card every single time you knock out your opponent's active Pokemon with damage. You can really attack with Ultimate Ray, or after you use Ultimate Ray, you can use Brave Blade to do a lot of damage, and of course you have some damage modifiers such as Rusted Sword, but you have Boss's Orders and Great Catcher to bring up Pokemon and prey on your opponent's weaker Pokemon like the Dennet GX, Crobat V, Eldegoss V, and unevolved V Pokemon before they turn into V Maxes. That's really where this deck's going to see its success. Now, this deck has been around since Sword and Shield first came out, and it's been very good ever since. I think if you're a newer player to the game, this is probably one of the best decks that you could be playing. And I know a lot of people are going to be playing this deck and they're going to be like, yo, you want to know what, this deck's really boring. Boring doesn't mean bad. It means that it's usually doing the same thing, everything over and over again. So when you're complaining with your GreenZard deck when you start with an inconsistent start or something like that, maybe playing a deck like ADP is going to solve that problem. So make sure that you're not necessarily trapping yourself in a box. This deck is certainly strong. Just really keep in mind like where the rest of the metagame shapes around it, or where you feel comfortable playing this deck. I think that this deck can probably just stay within the top 3 until rotation. That's going to be my current take on it. It's just very easy to play, very easy to see success with, and it's not too bad to piece together, especially with the League Battlization deck. I know that we still have them available at all our Walmarts out here, and I mean, a lot of them are available on the Code retailer websites. So do stay tuned for all that. We'll see if this deck can make number 1 again, but I think it's going to stay within the top 3 for sure. And that's what we got going on for this video today. Did your favorite deck make the top 10? Does the top 10 list sound good to you? Again, if you haven't given this video a like or subscribe already, give this video a like to help signal boost it to other Pokemon fans. Subscribe to the channel as we try to approach 4,000 subs. And let me know in the comments below what's going on with your video, what are your thoughts on my takes, etc, etc. I hope that everyone's enjoyed this video and it helps them stay informed for the Players Cup and upcoming events. That being said, I gotta edit this video, and this video is gonna take me a while to edit, so I'll catch up with everyone later. Peace out and have yourself a great day. I want to give a huge shout out to everyone who's become a channel member so far. Some peeps love watching my videos, and I totally appreciate that, but some peeps have gone more than out of their way beyond just watching my videos and have supported me financially. So shout out to everyone who's been featured on this channel, who's going through this list of names. We actually have so many channel members that I can't fit them in a single slide, so I figured this might be the best way to get everyone appreciated and kind of showcase all of the top supporters of the Zach Lesage PTCG YouTube channel. Seriously, it means I mean it from the bottom of my heart. It's honestly, I'm almost at a loss for words, but I'm so happy that you are all appreciating and loving the content and that it's hitting home. And I mean, I'm up all in my feels, so I hope that you understand. And thank you so much, everyone. If you want to become a channel member, totally consider it. I'll make it worth your while. And I totally mean that. I'll do everything I possibly can for my channel members to make it sure that it's worth their while. So thank you so much, everyone, and it's just amazing. Thank you. For everyone who's wondering on how to become a channel member, I first and foremost appreciate your consideration. You can click on any one of my videos on desktop, and then you could click join. Join will give you all the opportunities about what we have going on. You could support my content, you could choose the deck list hookup where you get access to my deck list, and we have a group coaching package as well. There's a lot of other things like custom emotes, early access to videos that I try to offer. So you would just click join and you'd be good and you'd be featured at the end of these videos. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks so much for watching and supporting the channel. If you haven't already, it'd mean the world to me if you could subscribe to help support me as a content creator. Thanks again and have yourself a great one.